The Myanmar military has been invited to take part in an ASEAN defence meeting co-chaired by the US and Thailand. Well, that's despite bloc members struggling to deal with their country after it failed to deliver on a plan to end violence in the country. The 5-day defence meeting will include tabletop exercises that address search and rescue operations, piracy and drug smuggling. Well, despite being barred from the main ASEAN summit, the US says Myanmar has been invited in accordance with the organization's protocols. Myanmar attended the same forum virtually last year. US officials say they are still committed to responding forcefully to the military coup in Myanmar and are urging authorities to end the violence. Myanmar's top security body, which decides on state of emergency laws, says the country is still unstable. Now that paves the way for a possible extension beyond its 2-year limit. The National Defence and Security Council today, the eve of the country's coup anniversary, stopping short of making any decision. From all this, we're joined by our correspondent Leong Wai-kit. Let's take a look there. Wai-kit. Tomorrow marks 2 years since that coup that handed full power over to the military government. Emergency rule, could end tomorrow in principle unless the army decides otherwise. What do you think, in your reading, could happen?
Well, Wesu, I think that it's very likely that the Myanmar army would extend the state of emergency in either in some form of shape or some shape, because the signs are there. They met today. They said that the country is not stable. They could easily use this reason to either roll out an extension or even more stricter states of emergency. But some might argue that the Myanmar army doesn't even need a reason to do so, given that in the ethnic areas there are ongoing aerial bombings, burning of villages, indiscriminate killing of civilians. But those who understand the Myanmar army would point out that the army has a tendency to want to legitimize their own actions. So they're very likely to be using the constitution in 2008, which they wrote, which is the Myanmar law, and using that to exploit certain clauses that could allow them to extend that state of emergency. And I want to bring up a very side point on exploiting of such laws. This is not the first time that the Myanmar army written I beg your pardon. This is not the first time that the Myanmar army written constitution in 2008 has been exploited. Back then in 2015, when Ms. Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy won the elections, they too exploited that law and created the role of state councillor, because under the law she's prevented from being president because she's married to a foreigner. But back to your question on the state of emergency, few key points here. The Myanmar army will definitely want to legitimize their actions, if any, by using the law. And it's also about prolonging their power and holding on to power for as long as they can.
All right. One thing that might get in the way of that happening, of course, is if ASEAN takes a role in handling this crisis. Of course, ASEAN, the chair this year, is Indonesia, taking over from Cambodia last year. Now, given the public signalling we've heard both from Joko Widodo, the president, and also from Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi, how do you think Indonesia will be handling this crisis in Myanmar compared to how Cambodia has done last year?
Yeah, there's a lot of expectation that Indonesia would take a harsher stance as compared to Cambodia. Back then, Cambodia's position was that they had to engage the Myanmar army. They were friendly with the Myanmar army, but we don't know until we see what comes out of the ASEAN ministers' retreat that's happening later this week. Lots to talk about for the ASEAN ministers, including finding ways to end violence and discussing whether it's time to take a tougher stance or a more creative position. Of course, we're also looking out at whether the bloc can come up with or decide on the ASEAN's Special Envoy on Myanmar. Right now, we do know that Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi will be heading that new office, but there's no formal word on who the envoy will be. Now, I recently also met with UN's Special Envoy on Myanmar, Noeleen Heyzer. We had a very long discussion on Myanmar, and she highlighted to me some of the areas that she'll be focusing on this year. And one of the things is that she plans to rally ASEAN, Myanmar's neighbouring countries, as well as the regional community, to give better protection to people in Myanmar. So this could possibly and logically mean that the ASEAN ministers would have to think about, if a group of refugees were to flee to neighbouring countries without passports, will they be deported? as well as if Myanmar citizens were to fly to another country in ASEAN, whether or not those asylum laws in those respective countries need to be revisited.
Thanks so much. That was Leong Wah Kit. I'll cross on looking ahead at this inflection point just a day to go to 2 years since that military coup in Myanmar.